So you started your career in investment banking and worked at one of the world's largest agribusiness financial institutions. That's quite a long way from where you're sitting today, consulting your consulting business here in Queensland. Tell me about the moment that you knew that you had to pivot and how you found yourself here.
Yeah, thanks, Bronwyn. I guess my pivot moments came after I'd been in corporate and investment banking for about 13 years, and this was actually during the GFC, the global financial crisis. And I started to realize that my personal values were no longer really aligned to the majority of the values I kind of observed around me at work. I had an opportunity to get out, and for the next decade, I focused on people, working a lot in leadership development and in coaching. And then before I moved to Australia, actually in 2017, I was back in the Netherlands for a couple of years where circular economy had really started to take off. So I got really interested in the concept, particularly the word economy in that space, and what that really meant. So when I arrived then in Australia in that same year and realized that in Australia the concept was really not known at all, the Dutch government had just released their first circular economy policy in 2017. And as you know, there was only a handful of people in Australia in 2017 that understood circular economy. So I just realized there was a great opportunity to bring that experience and knowledge here. And as a result, that's where I sort of kicked off my career in circular economy. So I'd like to say the other day I said to someone, it's been 30 years since I finished my MBA. The first decade roughly was all about profits. The second decade was roughly all about people. And in my third decade, it's all been about planet and sustainability and circular economy.
Amazing. So, I guess that's and thinking about 2017 to, we're heading towards 2027 and where Australia is at in that transition. We can get to that a little bit later in the conversation. But before we get into that, I would really like, in your own words, I mean, what is this thing, circular economy, that we talk about? Not sort of the textbook definition, but I guess what does it really mean to you personally?
So for me, it really means using resources as efficiently as possible. So whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking energy, textiles, plastics, and with that, I think the first questions should really be, do I need it? And if I do, then how much do I really need? So I think that's where it really starts. And we used to be a lot better at this as humans. I think we all know the stories from my grandparents I remember my grandmother used to rinse out every plastic bag and hang it up on the laundry line and use it over again. And we've kind of lost our way a little bit with the convenience of consumptions these days. So I think that's one really big element. And the other thing is how it really ties into other challenges that we have around climate, carbon emissions, biodiversity, pollution, and how we can't really see these things in isolation. And where we can apply circular thinking is really an enabler to get better outcomes for these challenges as well. And I think, being smart with our resources applies everywhere, whether you're in Brisbane, or whether you're in regional Queensland or the tropical north. And I think that's for if every individual were to start every day with thinking, how can I be smarter with the resources that I have? I think we'd go a long way globally.
Yeah, so what sort of difference would that make, do you think, I guess, for a place like tropical North Queensland, where home on the doorstep to the Great Barrier Reef, obviously it's a wonderful natural asset that does a lot for us from a biodiversity and a planetary health perspective, but also, it's a big tourism attraction for Queensland and Australia more broadly. And, the reef is not disconnected from, health of healthy land and water on the firm land across in the coastal areas that surround the reef. So what does, I guess, for you, when you think about those circular economy principles and what you just described, mean for a place like tropical North Queensland?
So I guess it goes back to the same principle. So, we know that one of the challenges for the reef is the sediment runoff from the land. And a lot of those sediments have a lot of fertilizers and nitrogen, which is really damaging the reef. So again, it goes back to how can we use those resources more efficiently? What can we do as a landowner to make changes to how I manage my land so that I need less of it? And as you know, with some of the work that that Forterra does, where I'm on the board, is actually specifically focused on this. How can we actually be smarter, apply ecological principles to help the land be better managed, so that a landowner actually needs less fertilizer, and any fertilizer they do apply stays where it needs to be, which is on the land, and doesn't run off with the first big rainstorm into the waterways and then into the reef. So I think it applies everywhere, but it has different applications depending on where you are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so place-based is really, really critical. And I guess if we can draw on, what we could learn from, what you've seen in the Netherlands and more globally around kind of gold standard of circular economy, and thinking about our place-specific sort of challenges and opportunities, what are those places getting right? And even in Australia, what are we getting right? And really, I don't want to say what are we getting wrong, but what can we do better to think about how and apply circular economy in regions, for the one that we're talking about today, to really address some of those issues.
So I think one of the key things for the Netherlands is a very small country, right? It's 2/3 the size of Tasmania. It has about 19 million people, and already in the 1980s, when we didn't have 19 million people yet, we started to realize very quickly that we didn't have space for lots and lots of landfill. So that was one element. And the other element was that the Netherlands needs to import a lot of resources. So the needs of that drove that change in behavior. So we knew we can't just keep building landfills. We have to be smarter with how we manage that, which quickly became, how can we actually reduce our waste in the first place? So what can we do to turn off the tap at the top end, rather than just try to figure out what to do with waste? I think when I arrived in Australia in 2017, Queensland didn't have a landfill levy yet. They do now, but they didn't at the time. So that just gives you an indication that building a landfill or using landfill, there was no cost to it, and because there is all this space. So I think Australia has the challenge that there's so much space, you have so many resources, so you come from a real position of wealth, which then doesn't drive the behavioral change that we need to see. Now, I think things have changed in Australia over the last 10 years. We are realizing that it's not just about what we have and what we do here within Australia, but also our reliance on supply chains. We've seen this during COVID. We're seeing it again at the moment. And I think there's more and more focus on how can we apply circularity and the concept of circular economy to improve our supply chain resilience and reduce our supply chain risk. But also, how can we improve our productivity? Because the reality is, if you have resources and you get more value out of those resources, either because you use them more efficiently or you use them longer, that actually increases your productivity. So we have a real opportunity there. And I guess to your question, what are we still getting wrong, or where could we do better? I think when it comes to recycling, for example, also the Netherlands still has an issue with, not so much with getting the recycling industry up and running and the technology and the solutions, but it's one thing to get all the products in there and being recycled, but then the output, there needs to be a demand for the output product. And we're also seeing in Europe that this is still a challenge. And that's also a challenge here in Australia. So it's great that we're building recycling capability, but if we don't have anybody buying the product at the end of that, it's not going to stand up. So I think this is where governments have a role to play. So either through policy, but also through their own procurement. So this is where I think the Dutch government has done really great work. They've really thought about how can we leverage our purchasing power through our procurement to provide industry with an incentive to change.
Have we seen any good examples of that in Australia?
I think it's changing. We are now seeing some of the stewardship programs that are coming in. I think Containers for Change is here in Queensland is a great example of where that works. So before that scheme came in, all these containers, cans, etc., a lot of them were ending up in landfill. By putting a stewardship scheme in place, we've not only really improved the recycling rates of those materials, but we've also created an opportunity for charities and communities to actually earn money through that system. And I think that's a fantastic win-win-win system for all parties involved. So I think that's been a great success.
Yeah, and we've seen some, some things like that in the agriculture sector, like drum muster and
Yeah,
big bag recovery. But
yeah,
ultimately, if we to put to your point, offtake markets and the economics of the circular economy are just as important as the environmental outcomes. And so, thinking about how we create better systems, we call that product stewardship broadly in some spaces, to really make those economics stack up, but also provide meaningful benefits for not just the users and the consumers, but broadly in the community as well. Like you said, we see with containers for change.
yeah. And I think you're right. That's why the word economy in circular economy is about. It's got to be viable, right? It's not just. And I think that's where. What I actually thought was when I arrived here in Australia and I started talking about circular economy, one of the things that I really liked, because in 2017, climate was still a very contentious topic. But I found that I could talk about circular economy with anyone, whatever side of the spectrum of the sort of climate discussion you were on, because you're talking about a business proposition. You're talking about a system that ultimately focuses on cost savings, increase in productivity and supply chain resilience. That it has a lot of environmental impact and benefits is, of course, for some people that's the main reason, but for other people that's a nice sort of add-on benefit. And I personally believe that if it doesn't stack up financially, you're not going to change the masses to change their behavior, right? So we got to build something that makes sense for people.
Yeah, I'm drawing on your sort of your 3 decades of experience around profitability, and then people, and now sort of really around thinking about planet and how those things come together, and your experience working across government and also in big corporates and small SMEs as well. Where do you see I guess the issues where that the transition to circularity or the circular economy kind of breaks down? What are the kind of the missing links?
So I think the key thing that's different in from the current linear economy we have with the circular economy is the concept of collaboration. So it requires collaboration across industry and across the supply chain. And I think this is where organizations and governments and people, individuals, often struggle, as it sometimes requires to collaborate with a competitor. So a great example is in the Netherlands, where we have the Dutch Concrete Agreement, which was led by Professor Jacqueline Kramer, who's visited Australia a number of times, and recently she wrote a book together with Usha from RMIT on the circular economy in Australia. But basically what happened there was that the whole concrete industry in the Netherlands all wanted to move towards net zero, but everybody was kind of looking at each other, well, who's going to make the first move? So what Jacqueline Kramer did as sort of leading the industry is to say, right, we all need to move into the same direction. And she kind of compared it to the concept of peloton in cycling in a peloton, where every rider out there they're a competitor, they all want to win. But for most of the day, if they're riding in the Tour de France, they're all riding packed tightly together in a single group, right? So they're all sort of keeping each other in that same group. Until they kind of hit the finish line, and then they break away, and then one of them will win the race. And in a way, that's a really good lesson for competitors in business or in any field, that sometimes the smartest move is to work with a rival or with a competitor to create an outcome that neither of you could create alone, by setting, I don't know, a shared standard, opening up new markets, splitting the cost of research, taking on that bigger common threat. So I think that collaboration is still a real challenge here in the Australian market, even from government, where I often hear words to the extent of like, oh, we can't get our suppliers in a room because we've got anti-competition laws, and we're not allowed to speak to our suppliers that way. And it's like, well, these anti-competition laws are also in place in the Netherlands, but this is exactly what the government does. They sit in the room with their suppliers and saying, this is what we're looking for. Now, none of you can deliver this just yet, but the one that can actually start to work towards delivering this outcome that we're looking for, that's the one that we're going to support. And you all have the same opportunity to deliver that. And
Yeah, we've
that
certainly seen. Sorry.
No, that's it.
No, I was going to say, and we've certainly seen also, you talked about the containers exchange. That's, beverage manufacturers coming, from across a range of, individual businesses, and they have to sit around the table to sort of solve the problem. And I've been working in the battery stewardship space for quite a number of years, and the same thing, if you've got a policy ambition or a shared industry vision, the ACCC does in fact allow for, collaboration with some certain, I guess some uh, uh, safeguards in place, and you can really come together to solve this problem. And I think you're right. The whole idea around how do we collaborate in the human nature, and I guess maybe the corporate or the culture around it in Australia probably does. We need to be thinking a little bit differently. And I would argue, I would say, when we think about regions, and particularly, quite remote areas of Australia, we tend to, I think, be a little bit better at collaboration because we have to work together in order to get a better outcome for the region. So I see that as a massive opportunity when we think about the Herbert catchment and the myriad of growers, whether they're cane growers but graziers, and also the horticulture industry as well. So and then you pack that in with tourism and all the big operators that operate in that space, and you really have got some really interesting people and players and innovators around the table that could be doing we could be thinking about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you've been in the space here, as you said, for about a decade, almost a decade. What's taken longer, I guess, that you've expected, or what do you think is holding places back, like the Herbert catchment or regional Queensland more broadly?
I think first and foremost, as I said before, when I arrived here in 2017, nobody had heard of circular economy, and I sometimes say to people like yourself and me who've been working in this space for so long, we've actually come a long way, and we're definitely not there yet. But actually, if you see how much has changed in the conversation across Australia, where we've got some really, really good examples around circularity, Bega Valley, for example, is a great one. Where we're really seeing that the concept's starting to take off, and the more and more people understand what it means and what it truly means. So I think we have come a long way. And I think what's holding places back is it's often just not the knowledge or the awareness. I think particularly for places that are a bit more remote, what's absolutely critical is a really good understanding of what's happening in that region, really understanding who's doing what in our region, who's buying what from where, what are the materials that are coming into our region, what are the materials and the resources that are going out of, or products that are going out of our region, and are there efficiencies to be made in that. To give you an example, it might be that you have, there might be someone who imports a certain product, packaging material, whatever that is. And that company might be a small business that goes, listen, I can't buy it locally because the cost just doesn't stack up. It's just too expensive. So I'll just import it from China, say. But if that business knew that there were 3 or 4 other businesses within, I say, 100-kilometer radius, they were actually importing the same product. And then they were going, okay, there is a local supplier. And if we actually bundle our orders together and sort of look at that together, we might actually be able to create something that's worthwhile for that supplier and worthwhile for us as well in terms of cost. But often businesses don't know this. They don't know that there's maybe a business 60, 70 kilometers further down the road that actually buys exactly the same stuff from maybe a different supplier, but also from overseas. So I think it's data and understanding what's coming in and what's going out of a region is a real big starting point. And that requires that involvement and that collaboration with people sharing what it is that they're needing for their business and what it is that they're providing. And once you have all that data, you can start to bring those dots together.
So what you're really talking about is the material flow in and out of a community or out of a region. Yeah. So how do we do that? Like what needs to happen for that? And then how do we, the next step obviously is then bringing the people together where we can sort of see, okay, they bring a lot of if we think about sugarcane and one, there's obviously fertilizer, there's maybe a bunch of other sort of consumable products that are, like you say, we talked about drums and, something that's packaged in some sort of plastic. They're all using tractors. There's a bunch of tires, obviously, that they use on those tractors. So what does material flow mapping look like for a region?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. And it can be that you're initially focusing on a couple of material flows, right? It might be a bit too hard to try to get everything done in one go, but that doesn't matter. It's long, so tires, for example, could be a perfect example. Try to understand how many tires are being used every year, how many tires are being disposed. Often that's data that a council or multiple councils will have some data or some statistics on. How many tires are being imported into the region every year. So the moment you can start getting some data around that, and then it's about talking to the logical organizations or businesses that probably use a lot of tires, and garages, etc. When it comes to personal tires. For personal private cars, but start to get some of that data together. And then once you've got the data, that's when you can then start going, okay, hang on, what can we do differently with this as a resource? So I think material flow analysis is absolutely critical for being able to make changes that are actually then beneficial, and seeing where you can be more efficient, but also where you can then have those economies of scale, or where you can bring the top end and the back end of the supply chain back together. And I think that's really critical.
So one of the other guest speakers that we're going to be having in this series is from EcoBiz, or from the Business Chamber of Queensland, and they'll be talking about their EcoBiz circular economy module, and that has, I think, a really great material flow mapping tool that is free and available for organisations to use. And then, if a number of them are using it at a regional level, then you can start to get regional data on where as you say, those 5 people or 5 businesses are trying to source the same type of product, and or trying to think about what they do with that same type of product at the end of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as you know, I've done a lot of work with EcoBiz on developing that material flow analysis, and it's a very easy to use tool. And I think whether you're a small coffee shop or a baker, or whether you're a farmer, at the end of the day, waste that leaves your organization has all come in through the front door, and most likely you've paid for it. So everything. So at the moment you start thinking about what is my organization, what goes out of my organization or my business, and where has it come into my business, and what have I paid for it, right? And the moment we start connecting those things, I think businesses will be able to go, okay, I do my stock take at the end of the year, and I've seen this with businesses here, and they've got a lot of, say, promotional material, and at the end of the year they've got all that promotional material and they didn't use half of it. So then the question should be, okay, well, we clearly bought this stuff. Maybe we need to order less for next year, because clearly we're not using half as much as what we used to. But in a lot of organizations, these two things are not connected, right? So the person who's doing the stock take is not necessarily feeding that back to the person who does the purchasing, who does the procurement. And that's what a material flow analysis allows you to do, to bring those things together. And what that looks like will be obviously different for a farmer or a coffee shop owner, but I think the concept is the same. It's like, what comes in, what do I use, what goes out, and how can I make that more efficient to not just increase my productivity, but also save cost at the front end by perhaps purchasing less, and at the back end by having less waste, which is also a cost for businesses.
Yeah, and that's a huge opportunity in terms of not just reducing the cost, but also, as you say, keeping what can be kept in circulation. How else can we be using it? If it's reached its end of life. So if we've got a bunch of stakeholders in the Herbert region, and we've done we've worked with them to identify some key opportunities in terms of what we just know, because we know the types of industries and we know what the opportunities where they might lie, and then we do some thinking around, well, what are the kind of the core material flows? What's the next, what's your advice to the region on kind of the next best place then to sort of start from there? You talked about value chain collaboration. Is it around what does that look like, or is there something else in the middle there?
No, I think value, it's what I said before. It's about, once you have that understanding, it's literally getting people in the same room, whether it's virtual or physical, and it start mapping that. So mapping that value chain and see how you can actually then look at, hey, somebody's output might be somebody else's input.
Mm.
And what often where, again, council and government can play a role is by bringing these different parties together, because often that's what it needs. It's, the word transition broker is often used in the Netherlands. That's become a real term, and it's great to see that the federal government has now appointed a transition broker for circular economy. You kind of need someone who is able to kind of bring the right parties together, who can sort of look into that supply chain and go, well, hang on a minute, if we put all these parties together that are somewhat in the same supply chain, then we can start talking about, okay, well, what's happening with your business? What is your output? What's your input? And is there opportunity to work together in this space?
That's
So
a
that's,
really, yeah, it's
yeah.
a great term. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit more? What does a transition broker or network broker do?
So I think it is about bringing all these different parties together and having that independent role where it's really looking at those opportunities, and probably kind of sits above is kind of the wrong word, but sort of has that more systemic view of supply chains and value chains and
Mm.
understanding, and through their network. So hence the word network, is in they will have a large network of organizations and businesses that they know and that they're familiar with. So they can start, it's a bit like somebody who's putting a puzzle together, right? So they can start sort of going, okay, sometimes if you're in the puzzle, you don't see what's outside of it. And if you're sort of
Mm.
just one level above, you can sort of go, well, hang on a minute, I've just spoken to this person over there. They've told me they had a challenge with waste item X. And hey, the other day I was talking to another organization over there, and they were either having the same problem, or they were actually, I can see I can connect this. So a transition broker or a network broker is really somebody who's able to bring all those stakeholders together and who can start looking at building some of these connections. And it's hard, right? Because businesses, particularly in today's world, it's very difficult to get out of your
Mm.
day-to-day
Mm.
business, right? You're trying to make things work. You've got, everybody's is struggling at the moment with business, with cost of living, with productivity, with cost of goods, supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. So I can totally understand that for a business, it's hard to just kind of let all that be for a day and then go, right, what else is out there? And that's where a network broker or a transition broker can support, right? Because they can actually sort of play that role for them, and help them with that, help them see the opportunity.
Fantastic. I think that's very much where, we're sitting now with the Herbert Circular Futures project, and it fits into the broader Herbert Integrated project. And our organization, Futures Foundry, along with some key stakeholders, are really starting to play that role around connecting the dots, but we're still very much in the early stages. So I guess ending on a couple practical notes, if a young or innovative, or well, we're just an everyday grower or grazier is listening, and wants to know, what do I do? Well, what do I actually do next? What do I do Monday? What's your advice, I guess, to get started in thinking about how we can apply circular economy and realize the opportunities in the region?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's always good to educate yourself a little bit to understand more about what circular economy really means, and how that. So I always sort of say that the when I work with clients, the reason they come to me is they've got sort of three questions. Is that first day is that, well, what is it? What is it really? Um, what does it mean for my business or my organization, and where do I start?
Mm.
And I think for anyone to first start to understand a little bit more, which nowadays, there's loads of resources online. I'm sure you've got resources as well that can be shared. Then it's looking at examples. So I think the Bega Valley is a fantastic example. There's some great
Yeah.
podcasts, and ABC Landline, I think, did something on them. Get inspired. And then it's about, well, where can you start? And that's by understanding your business. So it's about, okay, well, what is coming into my business? That material flow. What am I buying every month for my business? What am I throwing away every month from my business? And that's data that as an organization you'll have available. You might need to do a bit of digging,
Hmm.
but start with that and then go, okay, how can I maybe do this differently? And that's where, reach out to, someone like yourself, reach out to your local councils to see if you can build that network of collaboration, talk to other organizations and businesses in
Mm.
your region to sort of bring those thoughts together.
Fantastic. And so if there's one thing, one key message that you would love to leave our listeners with in terms of, what's the one thing that you wish that people could understand about the circular economy, what would it be?
I think the one thing that I'd like people to understand is that it's really a system change. So it's not just about recycling, it's really looking at the whole cycle and about and how it interacts with other challenges that we have, as I said at the start. By using our materials more efficiently, it means that we need to dig less materials out of the ground, which has an immediate impact on our carbon emissions and our biodiversity and our ability to, and less pollution, etc. So I think it's really understanding how all these things connect together. That I think is what's really important for people to start understanding, and how we can all do something. If we all do something, as a result, we can really make some big changes.
Thank you so much, Marjonn. I think you and I could probably talk for hours on this topic. It's a deep shared passion of ours, and I really appreciate you, sharing your knowledge and your wisdom from, across the globe, and bringing that here to the Herbert catchment. So perhaps we'll have to do a follow-up for a next chat soon.
Absolutely, and thanks, Bron, for your time and for inviting me on this panel. I think there's such a great opportunity, and I think it's maybe for everybody, don't be afraid to start unpacking it. It's not as some people think it's like this big thing. You can start small.
It's a thing over there, yeah.
It's a big thing, and it means a lot of work. No, sometimes you can it doesn't really matter where you start as long as you start, right? I think that's the key thing.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bron.
Bye now.
Bye.